Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. If you are in the room or online, welcome to tonight's event at the Royal Society of Chemistry. We are incredibly privileged to be joined by an amazing author. I will get to that in a moment. I should probably introduce myself, first of all. So I'm Dr. Suze Kundu. I'm Director of Research and Community Engagement at Digital Science, and I'm a recovering academic nanochemist as well. Now, for those of you that have read Lessons in Chemistry, you will probably know that there are loads and loads of amazing stories, but also a bunch of really challenging topics as well, some of which maybe some of the people in this room may have experienced as well. So it really is no wonder that the book has been so popular. I believe 6 million copies so far have been sold worldwide, and we're joined by the very successful author of that book, Bonnie Garmus. Can we have a round of applause for Bonnie, please? For joining us tonight. I know that you've been on kind of a whirlwind tour, just, trying to talk to people about the book, about the themes, and we're so lucky to be in this room with you tonight. This has massively sold out, so I'm really glad that we're able to live stream this so people can access this wherever they are. I wonder if I can start with one of the hardest questions, given your amazing career. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm so glad you called it an amazing career. I would never say that about my career, but okay. I'm a copywriter, a creative director. So I've worked a lot in advertising, but I've also written a lot of speeches for people. And so my focus was always, copywriters are always assigned things that they know nothing about. So when I started writing Lessons in Chemistry, and people said, but you're not a chemist. And I said, I'm also not a cook. And I thought, this is just, this is what copywriters do. We learn a little. And so that was my career. I worked for a lot of people in technology, especially. And then we ended up moving here to London, and I was able to finish this book here. And that's really it.
You say that's it. I mean, it's pretty amazing. 6 million copies so far for a debut book.
Yeah, it is
something.
Shocking. No, it's shocking.
But it's incredibly popular, again, because of those themes, because of the relatability of those themes. It's not just a book about chemistry. It's not just a book about a TV, and I hate calling it is a chemist. But it is about, as I sort of described it, it's, labs, life, and love, really. It's all these amazing things that so many people can relate to. So I think it's lovely. You said technology. I think you also have, involvement in medicine, in education as well, and you can see all of these things brought into the book. So I suppose let's get to the book. For the handful of people that may not have read the book, don't know where they are or who they are, but can you, in a few sentences, sum up what the book is about without too many spoilers?
Sure. For those of you who haven't read it, it's about a woman in the late 50s and early 1960s who's a chemist, and she can't be a chemist because she's pregnant and she's unwed. And so she's let go from her job as a chemist at Hastings Research Institute. And she very reluctantly becomes a TV cooking show host. But when she decides to teach cooking, she's really teaching chemistry. But what she's actually teaching is far more subversive. She's teaching people what they're made of at a molecular level.
Oh my gosh, and then some. Yeah, yeah. It's amazing. So I'm an only child. I'm an only daughter, a daughter of an incredibly strong, independent woman, my mum, and a very supportive dad as well. So I was gripped pretty much from page one. I thought, oh gosh, this is my kind of rebellion. This is my kind of people. These are my sorts of characters. What motivated you to write such a book?
Well, I think, for me, in my career, there was plenty of sexism, of course, in my career. I think most women would tell you that, this has been an experience that we've all had repeatedly over and over. And the way the book started for me, actually, was I'd had a really bad day at work where I had presented my ideas for a very major campaign, $1 million campaign. And that day, a man in the room took credit for all of my ideas. His name is still on my campaign. And that day, when he spoke up and he started saying, well, I think we should do this, which were the words I had just left in the air in the room, I asked my coworkers for support. Now, I was the only woman in the room that day. And that is not unusual in technology or even in science still, but especially in technology. And none of those men that day, even though I'd worked with some of them for over a decade, none of them stood up for me. And I was really shocked. And I kept saying, I don't really understand what's going on. These are my ideas that I'm presenting. You've flown me all the way out here. I was living in Switzerland at the time to give you this campaign. It was as if I didn't exist. And so that day when I left that room, I thought, as I was walking back to this desk, I thought, how many other women in the world just had this day that I had? And I started to realize it wasn't just in California, and it wasn't just in the United States, and it wasn't just in the UK, it's worldwide. And I thought, millions of women are having the same day that I'm having. And what a waste of time and talent. And so when I went back to my desk, I had something due that day at 5. But instead of working on that, I wrote the first chapter of Lessons in Chemistry.
Wow. When I have a bad day, I eat chocolate and buy shoes.
Well, I did that too.
I wish I could be more productive. When I've had a rubbish day, I think the point you make that, the majority of these rooms are not representative of society, of the society that we're trying to serve in whichever profession it is that we work in. I mean, chemistry, maybe it's just one of them, but at most professional levels, the people at the top don't represent society because levels of privilege and reasons why people haven't been hampered in their career or had to take a career break are just not as apparent or as influential force for men and men of particular demographics in particular. It's funny, we were chatting just now about this idea of people stealing your own ideas and making it their own. It's something that happens in the book. It's something that I was telling you happened to me when I was a PhD student or a postdoc, I can't remember now. A better established colleague of mine published some of my work under their name. They work in Glasgow now. I hope it's cold where you are. It was such a thing that happened. And at that career stage, at that career level, I didn't feel I had any agency to really advocate for myself.
Right.
I think the idea of people taking your ideas and making their own, I mean, in some ways it's quite complimentary. In other ways, it's deeply frustrating. We need a diversity in the room. We need a diversity of thought to problem solve. What do we do?
Well, I talked about the men in the room that day. And when I was giving a reading in Seattle, I will say that I was sitting at this table and I saw this man coming at me. And of course, it was one of my colleagues from that day. And I hadn't talked to him since that meeting. I hadn't talked to any of those people since that meeting. And as he came towards me, he was looking very uncomfortable, but he had a stack of 10 books in his arms. And he bent down to me and he said, thank you for not naming our names. And I said, oh, that's okay. We're under NDA. But anyway, he said, I bought a book for everybody in the room that day. And I hope that you'll sign something special to each one. I actually was kind to 9 of them and not so kind to the guy who stole my ideas. But, he said something really interesting to me that day. He said that day he'd gone home. He knew what he'd done. He knew he hadn't supported me in that meeting. And he went home that day and he had 2 young daughters and he was reading them a bedtime story. And he said, I started to get really upset. I thought, what did I do to my colleague? What am I going to do? Because someone's going to do that to my kids. And he realized that he made a huge mistake. Now, he didn't contact me about that mistake until much later. But I think, for a man to speak up for a woman in a room, actually, we still need you to do that, unfortunately. We really need male allies. We need men to say, she was still talking. I want to hear what she has to say. Because the fact is, our brains are just as good as your brains. Our talent is just as good as your talent. And our world is so confused right now, and it's in such peril. Well, we cannot afford right now to shut any voice down, especially from if we segregate it and say we're only going to be listening to the men in the room. We cannot afford to do that any longer. And so my hope with this book, I said it in the 50s, by the way, because I needed reassurance that we have moved forward from the 50s. In the United States, we're trying very, very hard to go back to the 50s, and they're succeeding. But I think, we can do so much better, and women have so much to contribute. Everyone has so much to contribute. That's really what the book is about. Thank you.
You say the US is trying to go back to the 50s. The UK is saying, hold my beer on that. So don't worry, you're not alone. I think the point you make, about setting it in the 50s and hoping that things have changed, I do think that is true. I think we need to acknowledge that things have changed for the better, but slowly, because changing an entire culture is incredibly hard and cannot happen overnight. You need buy-in from so many different stakeholders. You need to see people kind of coming up in the ranks and stuff. But one example maybe of how that's changed is my 2 professional mentors have both been men. Mm-hmm. Professor Ivan Parkin at UCL Chemistry, my old PhD supervisor, and Mark Miodovnik. He's Professor of Science and Society at UCL, an amazing science communicator. And they, I think, are, a handful of many men that really do try and advocate for everyone having their say, for encouraging that diversity of thought and that representation. Again, because ultimately, particularly as chemists, what we're trying to do is solve societal challenges. And if we're not having society represented in the room, we're not able to do that to the best of our ability either. So I do think things have changed for the better, for sure. But it does beg the question then, there is still so much more to be done. But we must, I think, celebrate the progress that has been made.
It has been. And in the book, even in the 50s, there were male allies. There are 4 male allies in the book. There's Calvin Evans is a male ally. Walter Pine struggles, but he's a male ally. Wakely is one. The reporter Roth is one. So there are plenty of men, and there have been plenty of men in my life who've been male allies. We just need everyone to get on board with this. Especially, I think it is still true today. If you go to a technology meeting, it's almost all men. It's 95% men. And technology is the area that, as you all know, I'm sure, we're really suffering. A lot of bad things have happened in technology. We really need a lot more people in there who look different, sound different, and are different.
Yeah. Ultimately, to make the best technology for the most people. Yeah. There is a bravery often required by people when they need to speak up on behalf of somebody. Perhaps they don't possess the same characteristics of the person they're standing up for, but it's that level of active bystander behavior. And I know it's something that in the UK and globally, learned societies even are playing a part in that, in trying to train people and build confidence in being able to do that. But we must acknowledge that it is difficult. So what would you recommend that people do?
I get asked this question a lot, and I always have the same answer. It's okay that it's difficult. That's okay. Just go past it. Just stand up once. You just have to practice it. The minute you stand up for somebody else will get courage from you. And then it becomes this chain reaction. But somebody has to be the one to start it. And being the one to start it, it can be really hard, especially for a woman of color. But she has to know that she has support in that room. And so, I have 2 children, 2 daughters, both women of color. And they've asked me the same thing. Mom, what should I do? And I just say the same thing. Your responsibility, I don't care what you look like, is to speak up and don't be afraid. Well, you can be afraid, just don't show it. And other people will eventually join you because most people are pretty good. Most people have integrity. And I think all they need is just that little bit of watching somebody else be brave and do it first.
Yeah. And I think finding your own allies as well, knowing that if you may need to speak up, knowing that somebody in the room has your back as well, or if somebody does speak back to you or down to you, somebody else will advocate for the fact that no, they're speaking up for the right reasons, for the best reasons, to try and advance the thing that we're all working on. Yeah. I am going to talk about chemistry because I think it's safe to say quite a few people in this room might love it. Quite a few people online might be loving it. We're all, well into the chemistry. It's the language of life. I mean, one of the reasons that I chose to do chemistry was because I was an insatiably curious child. I'm an insatiably curious adult. And it was the closest thing I could get to trying to find the answers to all the questions I annoy my parents with even now. What made you choose to focus on chemistry?
Well, let me just say first, it was a very poor decision because I thought, because I am a copywriter, I'm always writing things I don't know. And I can do research and I can come up to speed on most things. And I thought chemistry, I really wanted to make her a scientist. And I thought if Elizabeth Zott was going to be on TV, realistically, she could only be on there if she was doing something home related. So I thought, she'll teach cooking. So I knew cooking was chemistry, so I thought, I'll make her a chemist. Biggest mistake of my life. Okay, your subject is pretty hard. And so I bought some textbooks off of eBay, old textbooks from the 50s, and I taught myself. It was labor. I taught myself basic chemistry. I also set our flat on fire twice. And the fire department came twice, same people, by the way, both times. And the second time, the fire brigade, the captain said, is that a chemistry textbook, experiment book right there? And I said, it is. And he said, should you be doing this in your flat? And I said, well, we're renters. And he goes, oh. Anyway, the flames get pretty big with your experiments. People had assumed I was burning stuff in the oven. No, I was doing things I shouldn't have been doing. But anyway, I was so attracted to chemistry once I got into it because I realized, I was one of those people who went, chemistry seems very difficult. And then I got into it and I realized I've just been exposed to what makes the world tick. I had no idea that this is the central science. And when I realized that, I had this love and appreciation for it. And I had a greater love and appreciation for chemists. And so I literally started thinking, maybe we should have a chemist as president. What about a chemist as prime minister? Because I thought, if you really want to understand the world, maybe we should have a scientist in there, specifically a chemist. I don't think anyone's going to take me up on this, but I love this idea.
That's really, I'm taking that up. Hope for Suze. No, I think this is really interesting. I think you do need people that sort of fundamentally understand the basics of life and how the world works to maybe make decisions on how people's lives may work. I don't think we necessarily have that in politics. That's my personal opinion, but you can be a career politician now and be quite detached maybe from a lot of those things. And I think maybe society suffers for that. And that is a shame.
I think that society does, because without a basic comprehension of science, I think people, I'm sure that you experience every day science deniers. And that's been, when I say the United States is zooming back to the 50s, we're full of science deniers all of a sudden. It's pretty frightening to me that people are refusing to see how science actually works because they need it. I mean, half of those people would be dead if there hadn't been a COVID vaccine. So yeah, I think it is really necessary. And I think science education needs to start much younger than it does.
And maybe there's a part that scientists can play as well, in engaging the public more appropriately, better. The Royal Society of Chemistry, I know, have done a bunch of work on this. And actually, as chemists, we sort of do ourselves a disservice because public attitudes to science surveys suggest that the public do want to know more and they do trust scientists and they do trust chemists. But we had a perception, at least in the last survey that I saw, that the public didn't trust us as much as they actually did. So we're already starting on a sort of apologetic back foot, and we don't need to, because actually the research should tell its own story. All the different faces that are part of that research are building trust in the fact that that research is being done, with as much integrity as possible, with as much trust as possible, ultimately to help people. But maybe, that's something we talk about, small changes that everybody can make, small contributions that every person can make. And maybe that's something we all decide to take on a little more of, just try and engage with society, learn about what society needs as well, and respond to that. Start a dialogue, a real conversation. Yeah. You mentioned that chemistry is hard. But I'd argue that your book maybe says that actually anything that might be perceived to be difficult just needs to be communicated in the most appropriate, most contextual way for the people that you're communicating with. Discuss.
Okay. One of the messages of the book is not to turn away from the difficulty. I mean, that was certainly a clear message to me when I was studying chemistry, because it was quite difficult for me to get into it. But yeah, I think that it is really important for people to face things that are difficult. It doesn't have to just be science. It can be anything in your life that feels impossible to you. And I think, my character, I want to have a very rational character lead this book. I wanted rationality to be the main theme of the book, because I think all of us are kind of tired of fake news and kind of not sure, if what we're reading is correct or not, or real. And so I wanted a kind of a return to integrity in science, in news, in most things, and then a sense of respect for what people say. So when Elizabeth Zott encounters something that isn't logical to her, instead of really trying to understand it, she'll just say, no. And that part of it, of her simple pushing away of, I'm not going to go down that road with you. I'm going to base my decisions on evidence. I'm going to make my decisions based on what I know of the world and how it could operate. And of course, our world is far more than science. Of course, it's culture and anthropology. And certainly there are lots of anthropological studies that talk about what other cultures do and how some of what they do should probably transfer to our culture.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's so true. And actually, it sort of brings me to the involvement of Indigenous cultures and learnings as well in the science that we're doing too. You mentioned integrity. I think that is such a hot topic, not just in society, but within research as well. For those of you that are still active researchers in this room, you will know that we are bombarded with information. Research is being sort of published at this unprecedented rate. And so not just to keep on top of all of that research and the latest findings, but to decipher and understand what is trustworthy, which research has been done with the correct level of integrity is incredibly hard. And I think actually what's really lovely is almost in the same way that, an advancement in microscopes helps you do a new level of research. I think advancements in technology, funnily enough, are helping us get through all that information and decipher now using, artificial intelligence and things like markers of trust markers within research, helping us decipher actually which are passing the test and which maybe are not as trustworthy.
Right.
So I think that's really encouraging. You mention in your book, there is a quote that I'm going to read out. When women understand chemistry, they begin to understand how things work. They begin to see the false limits that have been created for them. I don't know if you've seen the Barbie movie.
Yes, I have.
So the Barbie movie is an amazing example of how no society should be run by one group of people alone, because it doesn't work. It puts a mirror up, I suppose, against the society in which we live in, which is predominantly led by men. We have men that tend to be at decision-making levels. We don't have representation of women when people are making decisions on things like reproductive health or medicine and things like that. Without the lived experiences, we can't possibly be making decisions for everybody. So what can be done about that? What changes would you like to see?
Well, I really think, and I know unfortunately this doesn't help with current society, but I really think it lies in education. I really think if children were raised at a very early age to understand genetics, for instance, if they actually started studying genetics when they were 4 years old, we'd probably end racism pretty quickly. If they understood a little bit more about chemistry and things like that, and I think kids would be so excited, to do things like that. I know when I was growing up, I didn't encounter science until I was 16. That's too late. And I just think there's so many kids who are missing out on this really important education. So yeah, I think that it's going to start with education, but I think also in academia, I sense, I don't always sense this because I get a lot of emails every day and a lot of direct messages from people all over the world in academia saying, my lab and my advisor are the same people in your book. And it's 2023. And so that's a little bit worrisome. But I think if we keep pushing this, and one of the ideas behind the novel, I really wanted to bring this up, was to make the novel enjoyable. The novel is not screaming at you to change, in a scolding way. It's sort of pushing you along in a gentle, jovial way. And I think that's how people do change. They don't want to be blamed. They don't want to be scolded. But they do usually want to do the right thing. It's so often people don't know what the right thing is. And there's so much unconscious bias in the world that showing people what that looks like and what it sounds like, and you can clearly see it in the book. I've had so many great messages from men around the world saying, God, I do that. They see it and they go, wait a minute, I'm doing that. And then they realize I've got to stop doing that because I have a daughter or I have a wife or I'm just a great human being and I want to be better. And so that's really why the book was shaped that way and why there's humor with all the darkness. Because, the world is pretty bad in some aspects, but it's also pretty great. And I think we all want to save the great. And I think scientists are the forefront of that. I honestly do.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that's maybe the second time you've mentioned that a woman or a woman character in somebody's life is seen as a woman in relation to their relationship with somebody else, a daughter, a mother, a wife, a sister. I do think maybe a lot of conversations that people have, that realization does only come when they realize, oh, that could be my sister, that could be my daughter. But we do need to step up a bit, don't we?
Yeah.
We need to stop seeing people just in relation to our relationships with them. We need to say, this is 50% of the 51% of the population that is not having a voice. And I think you are right. I think it does start at such a young age. I had a friend of mine who has 2 young daughters. And when they were growing up, they were given this card game where they have a picture of somebody in a profession and they have the name of that profession on the card. and the doctor was a woman and the nurse was a man. And at the age of 3, his daughters started matching doctor with the male nurse and nurse with the woman doctor. And it's because of, and this was, that both parents were scientists, but it's sort of society and popular culture and, all the adverts that they see seeping in and reinforcing these kind of gendered roles that people have in society. One of the other learned societies in the UK, the Institute of Physics, did a survey showing that of the people that were choosing to study physics, one of the science, technology, engineering, and medicine subjects, more people from girls' schools and single-sex schools, girls' schools, were choosing to do physics than girls that attended mixed schools, mixed-gendered schools. So there is something to be said about trying to almost keep out that sexism within science and around science. So what kind of role do you think popular culture is playing, and what would you like to see change in that? I mean, it's huge.
Well, one thing that's been happening with the book that I think is actually starting to change things, and I'm the first one shocked to say this, most of the messages I get lately are from 15-year-old boys. And the reason why is because the book has been adopted into schools. And so I hear from these 15-year-old boys all the time about the book, and they're like, yeah, I think girls can do this. And of course, they've been amazing. Actually, this one kid, though, it's my favorite direct message of all time. He wrote me and he said, "Dear Bonnie Garmus, thank you for writing lessons in chemistry. It was way better than Lord of the Flies." Anyway, I love their messages so much, but what's so telling is that some of the messages are quite sad. And one young boy, I think he's 14, he wrote me and he said, I asked my mom why she lets my father talk to her that way. He said, after reading your book. And so he'd heard it all his life, but it didn't occur to him that maybe that wasn't correct until he read the book. And so I think if we kind of get teenagers to think about this, then we raise these generations of people who are changing. And I actually see a lot of change. I feel really great about the upcoming generations. They're thoughtful, they read a lot, just shocking. And really, I feel very positive about the changes that the younger generation is making. So I think that we're on a steady climb.
Yeah. And as we said, culture change takes time. And
takes a lot of time.
There are sort of cycles of time through history of progress and sort of regression and progress and regression. And it's a bit sad, but I think things maybe have gotten to this stage where people are going, no, this isn't okay. We need to work much harder to make this better.
And one of the problems is, of course, sexism is not confined to men. Women are sexist too. And I am constantly battling, my friends will say, well, I have sons, you know how boys are. And I'll think, okay, so you can't say that because you actually don't know how boys are. If you're raising boys, then you really have to be cognizant of the fact that you can't excuse behavior by saying that's how boys are. Same with girls. That's how girls are. That isn't exactly correct. And so, the language that we use around our children is really critical.
Yeah. And I think, again, that does start at such an early age. I mean, there was a big campaign in the UK, possibly beyond the UK, called Let Toys Be Toys.
Yeah.
And the gendering of toys for girls and toys for boys, and boys are allowed all the fun of space and dinosaurs. And even in your book, the spoiler, the chemistry kit that's proposed is sort of a lurid pink plastic thing. And you
to make perfume.
Yeah, of course. And bath bombs and things like that, because apparently that's all women want to do. There was a great, and by great, I mean appalling, advert that I think it was the European Commission made. And it was called Science, It's a Girl Thing. And it was a bunch of women immaculately dressed in very lab unsafe glasses making lipsticks or something. But you know what? It started a revolution, a little mini revolution, where a bunch of us got so frustrated by it that we created, this was back in 2012, 2013, so a decade ago, we created a calendar, not a dodgy calendar, a calendar of women doing real jobs in STEM and men as allies that were also a part of that conversation. So I do think maybe sometimes you need something so horribly provocative that it does make people go, I'm sort of done with this.
Yeah.
And there are aspects of your book and the theme of your book that do that exact thing, that it's developing critical thinking and it's giving people the tools to realize and the language within which to realize that this isn't okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose one of the themes again is everybody can make one small change. What would you like to see people stand up for, or how would you empower people to make that one change, to try and stand up for better representation and a better society for everyone?
I think if you go into a meeting and you know that there are going to be people in there who don't look like you, then talk to them. Just talking to them and making a connection with them is really, really important. And I think becoming a better listener. I've sat in so many meetings where one or two people have dominated the conversation and it hasn't gone well. We get very stale ideas out of those conversations and out of those meetings, and they haven't been worthwhile. I think I've been lucky enough to work with a lot of really great people. And like I say, you know, I've worked with some great men in my career, and I owe a lot to them and everything that they've taught me. But I really feel like I need to give back to these two women, especially in meetings, and show them that you can't just sit on the sideline. It's really not okay, because women still do, unfortunately. Again, you know, we have this bias in the world, but women are part of the bias. We have to overcome our own fears and biases.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I would say. I think that the most important thing everyone could do every day is just speak up,
mm-hmm.
say something. She was still talking. I want to hear what she has to say. Just that one phrase would change a room.
And I think maybe, you know, as people in this room, people that are watching online, as we start to kind of establish ourselves within our professional communities as well, maybe just reinforcing that there are ways for people to contribute that's appropriate to them. Maybe I'm thinking kind of more broadly in terms of diversity, but yes, you know, gender is one thing, ethnic background can be another, but there can be a series of things that have eroded a person's confidence, I suppose, that means they don't feel that they can speak up, maybe in the room at the time. We need to take into account things like neurodiversity, for example. And so I suppose as we all start to establish ourselves in our careers, finding mechanisms through which everybody can contribute, whether it's sharing an agenda or sharing papers in advance and welcoming in comments so that they can be fed back to the group. There are things that we can all do to encourage everybody's involvement. But then I suppose, as you say, being brave and taking that opportunity to contribute as well is incredibly important. And one, I think maybe, as you said, we need to be braver and bolder, and we need to kind of overcome some of that uncomfortable feeling as well. Yeah.
I was in Dubai, and I'd given this talk, and then these women, they were so nice. These about 25 women dressed in burqas took me aside and asked me if I'd come in a separate room and talk with them. And I said, sure. And they were incredible. You know, they were so delightful. But they said the funniest thing. They wanted to talk about how women were doing around the world, and what their situation was. And I said, well, we're really having, you know, a really rough time in the United States right now. And they said, oh, you're having a rough time in the United States. I don't know, it's just the way they said it. It was so funny. But what was charming about the entire thing, and what was so instructive to me about the entire thing, is that, as one of them said, and one of them, by the way, was a chemist. She was not allowed to work as a chemist, but she's a chemist. And she said, you know, there's something in your book where you talk about how we are all 99.9% the same. How does this escape everyone's notice? How do we not know by now that we have more in common than we have things to argue about. We are 99.9% the same. And she's sitting there talking to me in this burqa, and she goes, by the way, I love my burqa. I can eat whatever I want. Things are good with me. She was incredible.
I love that.
Yeah. Everything fits all the time. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
We are going to be taking some questions from the audience. So if you would like to ask Bonnie a question, could you put your hand up, and Edwin will come around with a microphone. And just while people are taking the opportunity to be brave, as we've agreed we'll all do, and ask those questions, I'm just going to ask you about the chemistry, because you get into some delicious detail. How did you choose what to include, and did you have just an amazing chemistry consultant on hand with which to work that through with?
No, so I have a very dear friend. She has an MBA from Stanford, a PhD in chemistry from Yale, and a PhD in microbiology from Princeton. She's just an idiot. Anyway, I called her up and I said, would you proofread the chemistry in this book? Would you double check it? And she said, of course I'll do that for you. And then she called me the next day and she said, you didn't tell me it was set in the 50s. And I said, oh, surprise. So she said, but Bonnie, now I have to research old science. And I said, I know, and it's not fun. Let me point you at a few things. No, I hired 2 PhD women, chemists, to make sure the chemistry was correct. And I had 2 mistakes in the text, and I was really proud of that. And now the book has become a series, and apparently it's riddled with chemistry mistakes. So, oh well. Hollywood, they're like, yeah, you know, it's pretty close. No, apparently not.
No. We were talking about the responsibility that pop culture has. You know, that's going to break many hearts in this room. We do have a question here. Can you introduce yourself and share your question?
I can, yeah. Oh, sounds excellent. I'm Claire Gallery Strong, and I've come a couple of 100 miles today to, I have, from Scotland, just South Scotland, very cold, you're right. I'm treasurer as well of the Royal Society of Chemistry, and I'm a nuclear scientist. So the question I'm sort of a bit curious about is what's next? So I mean, you know, the next theme for a book that would really take and shape the conversation even another step. That was my curiosity. What's next?
Well, unfortunately, I'm sorry, since you came all the way from Scotland, I never talk about what I'm writing. I even did that at work, you know, where people would say, you know, can you give us an outline, tell us what you're going to do? And I'd say, oh no, I don't work that way. I can't show it to you until I'm done. And they go, that is not convenient. Wrong writer. I just have to keep it all in my head, but I am working on a new book. It has different themes in it. It's going in a different direction, but these are still themes I'm passionate about.
You kind of stole my last question though, but I'll forgive you because you're brilliant and also a nuclear chemist, so far cleverer than I am. I think we are going to have some questions from YouTube as well, so I'm just going to open those up. Do we have any other questions from the room? Hello, please introduce yourself and share your question.
Dr. Tim Jones, did you base the character of your empathetic dog on a dog of your own?
Yes, I did. Yes, 630 is the only character in the book that's actually based on a real live being, and that was our dog Friday. We got Friday at a shelter, and she'd been horribly abused by someone. He'd been so horrible to her. He'd burned cigarettes out on her. He'd cut her. She didn't have any bottom teeth. She was young. She was about 2 years old. My children picked her out. They thought she was lovely. She had 2 kinds of mange. She smelled terrible. She never got over smelling terrible. That was just her scent, it turned out. But she also turned out to be the Einstein of dogs. And she was so smart and so quick with words. We did not set out to teach her words. She would just show us what she knew all the time. And my favorite example of this was I was late for work, and she used to go to work with me. And I said out loud, I can't find my keys, which was something I'd said about every day, probably. But she looked at me, and she started going through my briefcase, and then she went through my gym bag. And then she opened the door to the hall closet and she went through all the jackets, all the pockets, and she found my keys and she threw them on the floor like, can we go?
Oh.
When I had a stick shift, you know, manual driver, when I would drive, she always put her paw on my hand like, let's go. She was very, very loving and very protective of our family, but she was protective of all living beings. So we also had a rabbit who lived with us and he hopped around the house. He was like a cat. He was housebroken. He had his little, you know, litter box and they used to sleep together. Friday didn't know that she should have been a predator. She didn't have a mean bone in her body, but she knew a lot of words. She would constantly demonstrate. Our kids would name a toy, you know, and just in conversation, she would go get it. You know, we'd hear her going upstairs like, I'll just go get elephant, you know. But we were transferred abroad. We were transferred to Switzerland. And we took Friday with us. And in order for her to get a Swiss passport, Friday had to take the Swiss dog test. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the Swiss dog test, but it is an hour long and they take your dog from you and it's all in German. And we thought, okay, well, Friday doesn't know German. Well, she comes back from the Swiss dog test and the person said, this dog is not American. And I said, well, okay. And he said, this dog is Swiss. This is the first dog that's passed this test 100% in 2 years. Oh. So apparently she speaks German too.
Oh, wow. I love it. Deserves a round of applause. Animals are amazing though, aren't they? We were chatting about the fact we're both parents when we were just before this interview, and my Faraday cat, I agree with you, the cleverest, most empathetic, most beautiful cat in the world. So we have some questions from YouTube, but if anybody does have a question in here, do put your hands up and the microphone will come over. I'll do a couple from YouTube first. So the first question is from Lizzie, and I think this is a really interesting question, so thank you, Lizzie. Were any parts of the book particularly challenging or emotional for you to write?
All of the sad, dark things were challenging and emotional to write. I'm a huge rewriter. So I'll write something and I'll rewrite it. And I kind of hated having to rewrite some of the darker scenes, but I knew I had to do it in order to get the rhythm right. But, you know, I think my poor husband would come home from work and I'd be like, I've been in the dark the whole day working on this one paragraph or whatever. But then I could move into the light. So that made it a lot better. But yeah, those were always very challenging.
I mean, you do really tackle some incredibly dark themes, including things like sexual assault by people in power. So yeah, I appreciated the humor as well, but also, I mean, there were moments in that book, and if you have read it, where I was I was crying reading it. So yeah.
Somebody asked me, they said, what do you call a book that has, you know, sexual assault and death and suicide and all of this stuff? And I said, I don't know, real life?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think nobody in this room will ever get out of life without suffering a pretty major tragedy, unfortunately. And I wanted the book to recognize that.
Yeah. Lab's life and love. That's how I describe it. We have one more question from YouTube and then I'll come to you. So Keith Maya, apologies, has a question from his daughter. I don't know their name, I apologize. Oh, you're here. Oh, you're here. Oh, this is from your daughter. Oh, lovely. Would you want to, you can ask in person.
I'm asking the question on behalf of my daughter, Nicola May, who's studying chemistry at St Andrews, and she would love to have been here. She's read the book, and I have as well. We both thoroughly enjoyed it. The book is set in the 1950s and 60s at a similar time to Rosalind Franklin. We were wondering whether you had Rosalind Franklin in mind at the time you wrote the book, because, of course, she did research into DNA, and her ideas were hijacked by two of our colleagues, and unfortunately, she died in 1958, and I think they got the Nobel Prize in 1962.
Right.
So we wondered if you had her in mind when you were writing, when you were writing the character of Elizabeth Zott.
I was very aware of Rosalind Franklin. I didn't want to base my character on her, but I have to tell you that I've heard from Rosalind Franklin's family. And I think that that has just been incredible for me to have her family come forward and say, thank you for writing this book. She would have loved it. She was a lot like Elizabeth Zott, and she just, no matter what, she just kept going. So yeah, I did not want to write. I was very careful when I was writing my characters not to base them on anybody, because I knew if I based it on one person that we all knew, people would go, oh, that's not how she really was, you know. And so also as a writer, it's very confining to work from real life. It's easier to work from your imagination, which is what I wanted to do. So I created each of the characters individually, starting with Elizabeth Zott. But certainly I knew from experience that there were a lot of women scientists who had been left behind, Rosalind Franklin included.
Mm-hmm. I am just going to mention a couple of other questions that have come in, which we have almost covered. So Alessia Kido was asking about whether you'll write another book, which I think we've already covered. Dr. Karen Strubantz was asking about the TV show and whether you've watched it. I think you shared some of your thoughts on that. There are many chemists in the room here that will happily help you, Apple TV. If you don't want to get your chemistry wrong. But if we can come over to you, could you introduce yourself and ask your question, please?
Hi, my name's Caro Garrett. I'm an educator. I was a physics and chemistry teacher through secondary school and teacher trainer. So one of the things I just wanted to say was in education, I haven't felt as nearly as much as I think people who work in academia and research have felt about that, mainly perhaps because so many women are teachers, but that's another thing. What I wanted to ask you about was one of the things that made the book really readable for me and unputdownable, I would say, is the humour in it. We've sort of mentioned that. And I just wanted to ask, sort of carrying on from that last question, did you find the humorous bits easy to write? Because I thought the humour was just wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, as a copywriter, I'd often get hired to humor up someone's speech, which was horrible because it would be someone who delivered the joke like this. You know, it was horrible. So when I write humor, I try to have as light a touch as possible, but I have a great reader. My husband's in the audience and he reads everything that I write. Because he's so well read. He's more well read than I am. It's really disgusting. But he's also very critical. He doesn't hold back on anything. But it is true that when he's reading my stuff, he doesn't ever laugh out loud. But what he does, if he finds something that's funny, he'll go like this. Like that. And then I know it must be really funny. Any kind of reaction. Otherwise, it is just like watching paint dry over there. You know, it's just his face is just completely, it's really scary. I don't like to watch him read, but I'll sometimes, you know, just to see if there's any change in his expression. But yeah, to me, humor is really important. It's the way in to get people to listen, because people won't listen to anyone preaching. You know, they're not going to listen to anyone yelling at them or scolding them or making them feel dumb, but they will listen to somebody who's, you know, we all have to laugh at ourselves. Sometimes we do some pretty stupid things.
Well, we are just animals after all.
We are just animals.
There is one more question from online, and it is from Laura. And Laura asks what your favorite recipe is that Elizabeth makes in the book.
The brownies.
I knew it.
I am a terrible cook. It's been so bad for me. I had no idea that people wouldn't realize copywriters really know nothing. We know a little about a lot of things. I am not a good cook. I've never been a good cook. My husband's a great cook. My kids are great cooks. So that's pretty good. That's 3 out of 4 family members. I've never enjoyed cooking. I never watched any cooking shows. And so people would say to me, oh, did you base this on Julia Child? I've never seen Julia Child. And my husband made me watch an episode of her. And I said, wow, she's pretty good. And he goes, yeah, it's Julia Child. Anyway, I think my favorite recipe in the book, so the recipes are based on what my mom used to make us. But the recipe for brownies is based on what my family does when we have a bad day we have brownies for dinner, and we call them desperation brownies. And when the BBC Food did an episode at our house, and they were filming me, and they couldn't believe when I took out this recipe from the cupboard. It's just written in my horrible handwriting. It looks like, you know, a child wrote it. And at the top, it just says desperation brownies. And she said, it's literally called desperation brownies. And I said, whenever we have a bad day, we just make this. And that's what we have. So I put that in the book.
I love it. Well, I hope none of us are going to resort to desperation brownies, certainly not after this conversation. A little shout out to everybody that is watching online. There are people from the US, the UK, Uganda, Jordan, and Angola, and they're all wishing you the best and thanking you for writing such an amazing book. If you are in the room, Bonnie is going to be signing some books, which you can purchase just outside of this room. I may be joining them because this has really been through the mill. But I do think this is one example of how imperfections can lead to a hidden, stronger and more beautiful inside, because I would not have discovered the hardcover if I hadn't destroyed the cover on it through my travels. I think all that is left for me to say is thank you to all of you for joining us, either in the room or online. And of course, a massive thank you to you, Bonnie, for spending time with us tonight and letting us ask you some tricky questions and about desperation brownies.
Thank you, Suze. So much. It was really, you were wonderful.
Oh,
thank you so much.
You're brilliant. Thank
you.
Thank
you, everyone. Thank you. You were really good.